The scars that marked her body were nothing compared to the ones that had been etched into her soul. Yet Delilah Summers stood tall on the auction block despite the whispers that followed her like shadows. The year was 1873, and in the dusty frontier town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, human worth was measured in dollars and usefulness, neither of which seemed to favor a woman whose body bore the visible evidence of a harsh life. The summer heat was unforgiving in Redemption Creek. Dust swirled through the air, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that found its way into eyes, noses, and mouths. The auction block stood in the center of town, a crude wooden platform where livestock, goods, and occasionally people changed hands. Delilah Summers had never imagined she would find herself standing on those weathered planks. At 23, she had already lived several lifetimes' worth of hardship. Her thin cotton dress did little to hide the web of scars that traveled up her arms and across her collarbone, remnants of the fire that had claimed her family's homestead 3 years prior. Next up, a woman can cook, clean, and sew. Healthy enough for work, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the crowd of men who had gathered in the town square. He neglected to mention her name. To him, she wasn't Delilah. She was merchandise. Damaged goods that the Wilkins family was selling off after deciding she wasn't worth the trouble of keeping as a housekeeper anymore. "What happened to her face?" someone called out. "Looks like she tangled with a mountain lion and lost." Another voice jeered. Mrs. Wilkins had made it clear. Delilah's scars were frightening the children, and Mr. Wilkins couldn't bear to look at her anymore. They'd brought her to town with a simple choice: be sold to someone who would take her, or be turned out with nothing. "Starting bid at $5, the auctioneer called, his voice dropping lower than it had for the horses sold earlier. Silence followed. Delilah kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to acknowledge the shame burning in her chest. $3? The auctioneer tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. More silence. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men turned away, others laughed behind their hands. "Ain't worth the trouble," someone said loudly enough for her to hear. $2, the auctioneer said, nearly pleading now. "Strong back, good worker." From the back of the crowd, a deep voice cut through the murmurs. $20. The crowd parted like water around a stone as Caleb Shepard stepped forward. At 32, he was known throughout the county as a man who kept to himself, running his modest cattle ranch with quiet efficiency. His broad shoulders and weathered skin spoke of years of hard work under the punishing sun. But it was his eyes that everyone noticed first, a startling blue that seemed out of place against his sun-darkened face. $20? The auctioneer repeated, unable to mask his surprise. "I have $20 for the woman. Do I hear 25? No one challenged Caleb's bid. Most men in town gave him a wide berth, respecting the invisible boundary he seemed to draw around himself. "Sold to Mr. Shepard for $20. Caleb approached the auction block, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Up close, Delilah could see the fine lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw that suggested a man unaccustomed to smiling. He was neither handsome nor plain, simply weathered, like the land itself. "Come on, then," he said, extending a hand to help her down from the platform. Delilah hesitated, studying his face for any sign of cruelty or mockery. Finding none, she placed her hand in his, noticing how small her fingers looked against his calloused palm. As they walked away from the auction block, the whispers followed them. "Shepard's gone soft in the head. What's he want with damaged goods like that? $20 for that? Must be desperate for company out on that ranch." Caleb ignored them all, leading her to a wagon parked at the edge of town. A beautiful chestnut mare was hitched to it, stamping impatiently in the heat. "Can you climb up?" he asked, his voice neither gentle nor harsh, just matter of fact. Delilah nodded, gathering her skirts and pulling herself onto the wooden seat. Caleb settled beside her, taking up the reins. "I'm Caleb Shepherd," he said as the wagon lurched forward. "My ranch is about 10 miles west of town." "Delilah Summers," she replied, her voice raspy from disuse. She hadn't been asked her name in so long, it felt strange to say it aloud. "Well, Miss Summers, I could use help around the place. Cooking, cleaning, whatever you know how to do. I'll provide room and board, and fair wages after you work off what I paid today." Delilah turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "Wages? You're not. I thought." "You thought what?" His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "Nothing, Mr. Shepherd." They rode in silence for several minutes before Caleb spoke again. "Those scars don't make you less of a person, Miss Summers. Just means you survived something others might not have." She didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken of her scars with anything but disgust or pity. "You're beautiful, you know," he added, so quietly she almost thought she had imagined it. "Not despite those scars. Maybe because of them." The words hung in the air between them as the wagon rolled on, leaving Redemption Creek behind. For the first time in 3 years, Delilah felt something like hope unfurl in her chest, fragile as a new leaf, but there nonetheless. The Shepherd Ranch came into view as the wagon crested a gentle hill. It wasn't grand by any means, but it was well-maintained, a modest 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, and several outbuildings spread across the property. A small creek wound through the western edge, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. In the distance, a herd of cattle grazed peacefully on the golden grass. "It's not much," Caleb said, misinterpreting her silence for disappointment. "But it's mine, free and clear." "It's lovely," Delilah replied honestly. After 3 years of living in the cramped servants' quarters at the Wilkins home, the open space felt like a luxury. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, then led her toward the house. "I've got a room for you upstairs. Used to be my sister's before she married and moved to Denver." Inside, the house was surprisingly clean for a bachelor's dwelling, though sparse in decoration. The main floor consisted of a kitchen with a large wood-burning stove, a dining area, and a sitting room with 2 worn armchairs facing a stone fireplace. A narrow staircase led to the second floor. "Your room is the first door on the right," Caleb explained, carrying her small bundle of belongings up the stairs. "Mine's at the end of the hall. Bathrooms between with a pump for water. It's not fancy, but it works." He pushed open the door to reveal a simple but comfortable room, a bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser with a mirror, and a rocking chair by the window that overlooked the creek. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said, placing her bundle on the bed. "Supper's in an hour. You don't need to cook tonight. Rest up." With that, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the wooden stairs. Delilah sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to process the sudden change in her circumstances. That morning, she had been a servant on the verge of being cast out. Now she was, what exactly? An employee? A servant with a better master? Whatever her position, it felt like a reprieve. She unpacked her meager possessions, 2 dresses almost as worn as the one she wore, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a small wooden box containing her most precious possessions. A locket with a tiny photograph of her parents, a blue ribbon her mother had once worn in her hair, and a smooth river stone her father had given her for luck. The mirror above the dresser caught her reflection, and Delilah found herself staring at her own face, something she had avoided whenever possible for the past 3 years. The scars weren't as angry red as they once had been, but they remained prominent, a slash across her right cheek, another cutting through her left eyebrow, and a web of smaller marks that disappeared beneath her collar. The fire had taken more than her family. It had taken her place in society, marking her as someone to be pitied, feared, or avoided. Yet Caleb Shepherd had called her beautiful. At supper, Delilah discovered that Caleb was a man of few words but surprising consideration. The meal was simple beans, cornbread, and salted pork but filling. He didn't press her for conversation, seemingly content with the companionable silence. "I rise at dawn," he said as they cleared the dishes together. "Breakfast is usually quick eggs and coffee. Then I'm out with the cattle most of the day. The garden needs tending if you're willing. Previous housekeeper let it go some." "You had a housekeeper before?" Delilah asked, curious. "Mrs. Holloway, elderly widow from town. Came out 3 days a week until her joints got too bad. That was about 4 months ago." He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "House has suffered for it." "I'm good with gardens," Delilah offered. "And I can cook more than beans if you have supplies." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Supplies arrive from the general store once a month. Next wagon's due in 3 days. You can add whatever you need to the order." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in years, Delilah listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft hooting of an owl, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. It was peaceful in a way that made her chest ache with long-forgotten contentment. Sleep came easily, and for once no nightmares followed. The following days established a rhythm to life at the Shepherd Ranch. Delilah rose early to prepare breakfast eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits that seemed to surprise and please Caleb. After he rode out to check on the herd, she turned her attention to the house, cleaning away months of bachelor neglect. The garden became her special project. Overgrown with weeds and suffering from neglect, it nevertheless showed promise. She spent hours pulling weeds, turning soil, and salvaging what vegetables remained: tomatoes, carrots, and peppers that had somehow survived on their own. On the 3rd day, Caleb returned from town with the supply wagon. "Added some things I thought you might want," he said, helping her unload sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, and an assortment of spices that made her eyes widen. "These must have cost a fortune," she murmured, examining a small tin of cinnamon. "Not so much," he replied with a shrug. "Figure good food's worth the expense." Among the supplies were 2 bolts of fabric, one a practical blue cotton, the other a softer material in a warm shade of green. "Thought you might want to make some new dresses," Caleb said, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "The green, it would match your eyes." Delilah touched the fabric, speechless. No one had given her a gift since before the fire. "Thank you," she managed finally, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb merely nodded, turning away to continue unloading the wagon, but not before she caught the faint flush across his cheekbones. That evening, after supper, Caleb lingered at the table instead of retreating to the porch with his pipe as had become his habit. "There's something I should tell you," he said, his fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "About why I was at that auction." Delilah set aside the dishcloth and sat down across from him, waiting. "I wasn't there for you specifically," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I was in town to sell some cattle. Heard the commotion and went to see what was happening. When I saw you standing there, and heard how they were talking." He shook his head, jaw tightening. "It wasn't right, treating a person that way." "So you bought me out of pity?" Delilah said softly, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "No." His eyes met hers directly. "Out of respect. There's a difference." The distinction meant more to her than he could possibly know. "I have scars too," he added after a moment. "Not all of them are visible." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood and bid her good night, leaving her with questions that would have to wait for another day. As July faded into August, the days grew hotter, the the sky an unrelenting blue broken only by the occasional gathering of thunderclouds that brought brief, violent storms. Delilah settled into life at the ranch with surprising ease. The house transformed under her care. Floors gleamed, windows sparkled, and fresh-cut wildflowers appeared in jars on the table and windowsills. The garden flourished as well, providing fresh vegetables for their meals. Using the blue cotton, Delilah sewed herself 2 new dresses, saving the green fabric for something special, though she wasn't sure what yet. Caleb remained a mystery, in many ways polite, fair, and occasionally thoughtful but guarded. He spent long days working with the cattle or mending fences, returning tired and sunburned. Sometimes he would sit on the porch after supper, smoking his pipe and staring at the distant mountains as if they held answers to questions he couldn't voice. One evening, as a thunderstorm rolled across the plains, Delilah found him in the sitting room, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a battered tin box open on the table before him. "I'm sorry," she said, pausing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his. "Join me if you like." Delilah hesitated, then sat, hands folded in her lap. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the room in stark white light. "My wife gave me this," Caleb said, holding up a small pocket watch. "Wedding present. Said a rancher ought to know the time even when the sun's not telling him." Delilah's surprise must have shown on her face, for he smiled faintly. "Yes, I was married once. Her name was Sarah." He set the watch down gently. "She died 6 years ago now." "I'm sorry," Delilah said softly. "Cholera. It swept through these parts in 67. Took her and our son within a week of each other." His voice was flat, as if the pain had been compressed over time into something dense and hard. Henry was 4 years old. Thunder rumbled closer now. Rain began to patter against the windows. "That's why you were alone at the auction," Delilah realized. "You lost your family. As did you, from what I gather." It wasn't a question. Delilah nodded, her fingers automatically rising to touch the scar on her cheek. "Fire. 3 years ago. Our homestead was north of Redemption Creek. My parents. They didn't make it out. And you did. With reminders etched into your skin." "Yes." She rarely spoke of that night, but something about the storm, the dim light, and Caleb's own loss made it possible. "I woke to the smoke. The roof was already collapsing. I tried to reach their room, but the flames were everywhere. Something fell a burning beam. That's how." She gestured to her face. "How did you escape?" "A neighbor saw the flames. Mr. Wilkins. He pulled me out just before the whole house collapsed." Her mouth twisted bitterly. "I often think he regretted that decision, especially after his wife decided my scars were an affront to decent company." Caleb's hand tightened around his glass. "Some people lack both sense and compassion. They took me in, though, gave me work when no one else would." Even as she said it, Delilah knew she was making excuses for their cruelty. "Only to sell you off when you became inconvenient," Caleb countered, his voice hardening. "That's not charity, Delilah. That's exploitation." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it affected her more than she expected. "What happened after you lost your family?" she asked, partly to shift attention from herself, partly because she genuinely wanted to know. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the house. "I nearly drank myself to death," he said finally. "Sold most of the herd. Let the ranch go to ruin. Blamed God. Blamed myself. Blamed the doctor who couldn't save them." He took a sip of whiskey. "Then one morning, I woke up and realized Sarah would have been ashamed of what I'd become. So you rebuilt. Slowly. One day at a time." He met her eyes across the table. The scars are still there under the surface, but they don't define me anymore. In that moment, Delilah understood what he had meant about respecting her. He saw in her what he had found in himself, the courage to survive, to continue despite loss. "I should check on the stew," she said, rising from her chair. The conversation had shifted something between them, creating an intimacy that both comforted and unsettled her. Caleb nodded, returning the pocket watch to its box. "Delilah," he called as she reached the doorway. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for telling me," she replied, and meant it. That night, as the storm raged outside, Delilah lay awake thinking about Caleb Shepherd, a man who had lost everything yet found the strength to begin again. A man who looked at her scars and saw beauty instead of ruin. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to imagine a future that might hold more than mere survival. The heat of summer gave way to the golden days of early September. The hills surrounding the ranch took on the burnished hues of autumn, and the cattle grew heavy coats in preparation for the coming winter. Delilah had been at the Shepherd Ranch for nearly 2 months, and in that time, it had become more of a home than any place since the fire. The green fabric had finally found its purpose, a new dress for the Harvest Festival in Redemption Creek. Caleb had mentioned it casually over breakfast one morning. "Town's holding their annual festival next Saturday," he said, buttering a biscuit. "Good opportunity to sell some beef, maybe trade for supplies before winter sets in. Thought we might go if you're interested." The idea of returning to Redemption Creek filled Delilah with trepidation, but also a strange determination. She had left that town in shame. Perhaps she could return on her own terms. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with her certainty. The dress took shape over the next few evenings, a simple design with a high collar to conceal the worst of her scars, but more fitted than her usual garments. With delicate embroidery she worked along the cuffs and hem. It was the finest thing she had owned in years. On the morning of the festival, Delilah rose early to prepare. She washed her hair with the lavender soap she had made from plants in the garden, then pinned it up in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. When she finally donned the green dress, she barely recognized the woman in the mirror, still scarred. Yes, but somehow transformed. Caleb's reaction when she descended the stairs confirmed the change. He stood in the entryway, hat in hand, dressed in his best shirt and vest, his dark hair slicked back with water. When he saw her, he went very still. "You look," he cleared his throat. "That color suits you, just as I thought it would." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "And thank you for the fabric." The ride to town was pleasant, the day crisp and clear. Caleb had hitched his best horses to the wagon, which was loaded with goods to trade: beef, vegetables from Delilah's garden, and a few quilts she had repaired. As they approached Redemption Creek, Delilah's anxiety returned. The last time she had seen these streets, she had been standing on the auction block, an object of pity and derision. "We don't have to stay long," Caleb said, sensing her discomfort. "Just long enough to conduct our business." "No," she said firmly. "I won't hide anymore." The festival was in full swing when they arrived. The main street had been transformed with bunting and lanterns. Stalls lined both sides, selling everything from food to handcrafted goods. A fiddler played on a small stage, and children ran between the crowds, their laughter rising above the general din. Caleb secured a spot for their wagon near the market area, then helped Delilah down. "Stay close," he said, offering his arm. "Town can get rowdy during festival days." She placed her hand on his arm, grateful for the solid presence beside her. Together, they moved through the crowd, stopping occasionally to examine goods or exchange greetings with people Caleb knew. The whispers started almost immediately. "Isn't that the Wilkins scarred housekeeper?" The one shepherd bought at auction? Lord, those marks are worse than I remembered. What's she doing, dressed up like that? Delilah kept her head high, though her grip on Caleb's arm tightened. He covered her hand with his own, a silent gesture of support. They had nearly reached the center of town when a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it isn't Caleb Shepherd and his purchase." Mrs. Wilkins stood before them, her round face set in an expression of distaste. Beside her, Mr. Wilkins looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting anywhere but at Delilah. "Mrs. Wilkins," Caleb acknowledged coolly. "Mr. Wilkins, I see you've cleaned her up some," Mrs. Wilkins continued, her gaze raking over Delilah's dress. "Though no amount of fine fabric can hide what lies beneath, I'm afraid." Delilah felt Caleb tense beside her, but before he could respond, she spoke. "It's good to see you both well," she said, her voice steady. "I hope you found a suitable replacement for my position." Mrs. Wilkins' eyes narrowed at Delilah's composure. "As a matter of fact, we did. Someone without your unfortunate appearance." "Then it seems we've all benefited from the change in circumstances," Delilah replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "If you'll excuse us, we have business to attend to." She tugged gently on Caleb's arm, guiding him away before the situation could escalate. Once they were out of earshot, he let out a low whistle. "That was impressive," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "Not many would stand their ground against that woman." "I've had practice," Delilah replied wryly. 3 years of practice." They continued through the festival, trading their goods and purchasing supplies for the coming winter. Despite the occasional whispers and stares, Delilah found herself enjoying the day, the music, the food, the simple pleasure of being part of a community celebration, even at its edges. As afternoon turned to evening, lanterns were lit throughout the town, casting a warm glow over the festivities. A space had been cleared for dancing, and the fiddler was joined by a banjo player and a man with a harmonica. "One dance before we head back?" Caleb asked as they passed the makeshift dance floor. Delilah hesitated. Dancing meant being on display, being noticed, but the music was lively, and something in Caleb's expression, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, made her nod. "One dance," she agreed. He led her to the edge of the floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist, the other holding hers. The music was a simple country reel, easy to follow, and Caleb proved to be a capable dancer despite his usual reserve. "You dance well," Delilah observed as he guided her through a turn. "Sarah insisted I learn," he replied, a fond memory rather than a painful one. "Said she wouldn't marry a man who couldn't dance at his own wedding." They moved together with surprising ease, finding a rhythm that felt natural. For a few precious minutes, Delilah forgot about her scars, forgot about the whispers and stares. There was only the music, the movement, and Caleb's steady presence. The spell was broken when someone stumbled into them, a young cowboy, clearly deep in his cups despite the early hour. "Watch where you're," he stopped, his bleary eyes focusing on Delilah's face. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you?" Before either of them could respond, he turned to Caleb. "Shepherd, where'd you find this one? Circus leave town and forget their freak." Caleb's hand dropped from Delilah's waist, his expression darkening. "Apologize. Now." The cowboy smirked. "For what? Telling the truth? Come on, everyone's thinking it. What kind of man dances with something that looks like—" He never finished the sentence. Caleb's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust. A hush fell over the crowd, the music faltering to a stop. "Anyone else have something to say?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet as he surveyed the onlookers. No one spoke. The cowboy scrambled to his feet, hand pressed to his jaw, but he had enough sense not to renew the confrontation. "I think it's time we left," Caleb said to Delilah, gently taking her elbow. She nodded, too shaken to speak. They made their way back to the wagon in silence, the festive atmosphere of the day thoroughly dispelled. It wasn't until they were well outside of town, the lights of Redemption Creek fading behind them, that Delilah found her voice. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "He deserved worse," Caleb replied, his knuckles white on the reins. "Maybe, but now they'll talk even more. About both of us." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon. "Let them talk," he said finally. "Words can't hurt us unless we let them." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Words had power to wound, to isolate, to shape how the world saw you and how you saw yourself. "Thank you," Delilah said after a while, "for defending me." "Always," Caleb replied simply, and in that single word was a promise that made her heart beat faster. The rest of the journey passed in companionable silence, the stars emerging one by one in the vast prairie sky. When the ranch finally came into view, it felt like a sanctuary, a place where scars, both visible and hidden, could be accepted rather than judged. As Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Despite how it ended, I enjoyed our dance," he said, his voice low in the darkness. "As did I," Delilah replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Good night, Delilah," he said, turning to tend to the horses. "Good night, Caleb," she responded, making her way to the house with her mind full of contradictions, the sting of the cowboy's words warring with the memory of Caleb's hand in hers as they danced, the shame of public scrutiny balanced against the pride of having faced it without crumbling. And beneath it all, a growing certainty that what she felt for Caleb Shepherd had become something far more complex than gratitude. The aftermath of the harvest festival lingered for days, an unspoken tension that neither Delilah nor Caleb seemed willing to address directly. They returned to their routines, Caleb with his cattle, Delilah with the house and garden, but something had shifted between them. A new awareness that made even simple interactions feel charged with meaning. The weather turned with the calendar, bringing cool mornings and the first frost. The garden yielded its final harvest, and Delilah spent long days preserving vegetables for the winter, canning tomatoes, pickling cucumbers, drying herbs to hang from the kitchen rafters. Caleb began the process of bringing the cattle closer to the ranch for the winter months, a task that kept him out from dawn until dusk. When he returned each evening, exhausted and often soaked from the frequent autumn rains, Delilah would have hot food waiting and fresh coffee brewing. One particularly cold evening in late September, Caleb returned later than usual, his clothes dripping and his face drawn with fatigue. "You look half frozen," Delilah said, helping him out of his wet coat. "There's stew keeping warm on the stove, and I've heated water for a bath." "You're an angel," he murmured, the words slipping out with an ease that suggested he was too tired to maintain his usual reserve. Delilah busied herself with hanging his coat by the fire, hoping he wouldn't notice the flush that rose to her cheeks. "Go on up before the water gets cold. I'll have food ready when you come down." While Caleb bathed, Delilah set the table and ladled stew into bowls, her mind wandering to dangerous territory. In the 2 months since she had arrived at the ranch, Caleb had transformed from a stranger into what exactly? Her employer, certainly. A friend, perhaps. But there were moments like at the festival or just now when she sensed the possibility of something more. Such thoughts were foolish, she reminded herself sternly. A scarred woman with no family and no dowry was hardly a suitable match for a man with his own ranch, regardless of how kind he had been. Caleb descended the stairs, his hair still damp, wearing a clean shirt and trousers. He looked younger somehow. The lines of exhaustion eased from his face. "That's the best I've felt all day," he said, taking his seat at the table. "Thank you." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the crackling of the fire. "I've been thinking," Caleb said finally, setting down his spoon. "Winter's coming on fast this year. I'm going to need help with the cattle. Thought I might ride into town tomorrow, see if any of the men from the Hayes Ranch are looking for work. They usually let hands go this time of year." "That makes sense," Delilah replied, though the thought of strangers coming to the ranch, strangers who might treat her as the townspeople, had filled her with apprehension. Caleb seemed to read her thoughts. "I'd make it clear from the start that you're to be treated with respect. Anyone who can't manage that won't be welcome here." "I appreciate that," she said softly, "but I don't want to be the reason you can't find help. The cattle need tending regardless of how men might feel about me. The cattle need tending, yes, but this is your home now too, Delilah. Your comfort matters. Your home." The words warmed her more than the fire. Over the past weeks, she had come to think of the ranch as home, but hearing Caleb confirm it made it real in a new way. "Actually," she began hesitantly, "I've been meaning to ask you something." "Go on." "The wages you mentioned when I first arrived. I've been here 2 months now, and I was wondering." She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "If you're due payment," Caleb finished for her. "More than due. I should have brought it up sooner." He rose and went to the sideboard, returning with a small leather pouch that clinked as he set it on the table. $20 to account for what I paid at the auction, and wages for 2 months at $10 a month," he explained. "Less the cost of the fabric, which was $5. That's $35 altogether." Delilah stared at the pouch, stunned. It was more money than she had seen in years. "That's very generous," she managed. "It's fair," Caleb countered. "You've done the work of 2 people and done it well." She reached for the pouch, then hesitated. "Actually, would you hold it for me? I have no safe place to keep it." "Of course. Or," he seemed to consider something, "we could open an account for you at the bank in town. In your name." The suggestion took her by surprise. An account in her name would mean something profound: financial independence, a claim to her own future. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Caleb nodded, returning the pouch to the sideboard. "We'll do it next time we're in town." He paused, then added, "Unless you'd prefer to go without me. After what happened at the festival, I'd understand if you wanted to." "No," Delilah interrupted. "I'm not ashamed to be seen with you, Caleb. Quite the opposite." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, an understanding that neither was quite ready to name. The moment was broken by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the windows, followed by the drumming of rain on the roof. "Storm's getting worse," Caleb observed, rising to add wood to the fire. "Glad the cattle are in the lower pasture tonight." Delilah began clearing the dishes, her mind still dwelling on their conversation. An account in her name. Your home now too. Small acknowledgments of her personhood that meant everything after years of being treated as less than human. As she washed the dishes, Caleb settled in one of the armchairs with a book, a familiar evening ritual. But tonight, instead of retreating to her room as she usually did, Delilah found herself drawn to the sitting room. She took the second chair, a piece of mending in hand, content to share the warmth and light. "What are you reading?" she asked after a while. Caleb held up the book so she could see the title, Moby Dick or The Whale. "Is it good?" "Depends on how you feel about detailed descriptions of whaling," he replied with a rare smile. "But yes, in its way. It's about obsession, really. How a man can be consumed by his own darkness. Sounds rather grim. Parts of it are. But there's beauty in it too. He hesitated, then asked, "Would you like me to read some aloud?" The offer surprised and pleased her. "I'd like that very much." Caleb's voice, usually so reserved, transformed as he read, becoming deeper, more expressive, bringing the words to life in the firelit room. Delilah's mending lay forgotten in her lap as she listened, transported by the story and by the simple intimacy of the moment. When at last Caleb closed the book, the fire had burned low and the storm had subsided to a gentle patter against the windows. "It's late," he said, reluctance evident in his tone. "We should both get some rest." Delilah nodded, gathering her mending. "Thank you for reading. It's been a long time since anyone read to me." "My pleasure," Caleb replied, rising to bank the fire for the night. "Perhaps we could make it a regular occurrence. The evenings are getting longer, after all." "I'd like that," she said, meaning it deeply. As they ascended the stairs together, Delilah was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the sound of his breathing, the creak of the steps beneath his weight. At the top, they paused, standing closer than was strictly proper in the narrow hallway. "Good night, Delilah," Caleb said, his voice low. "Good night, Caleb," she replied, holding his gaze for a moment longer than necessary before turning toward her room. Inside, with the door safely closed behind her, Delilah pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart. It was foolish, this growing attachment. Dangerous, even. Yet she couldn't deny the way her spirits lifted whenever Caleb entered a room, or how his rare smiles seemed directed at her more often lately. As she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror, the scars visible even in the dim lamplight. A reminder of all the reasons why her feelings for Caleb could never lead anywhere. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was his voice she heard, reading of distant seas and impossible quests. And for the first time in years, Delilah allowed herself to dream of a future that might include not just survival, but happiness. October brought more than just cooler temperatures to the Colorado Territory. It brought change to the Shepherd Ranch. True to his word, Caleb hired 2 hands to help with the cattle through winter: Daniel Miller, a grizzled veteran of several cattle drives, and Thomas Brown, a younger man eager to prove himself. To Delilah's relief, both men treated her with cautious respect. If they noticed her scars, they had the decency not to mention them, addressing her as Miss Summers and removing their hats when she brought meals to the bunkhouse. The routine of the ranch shifted with the additional hands. Caleb spent more time in the fields and less in the house, often returning only after dark, tired but satisfied with the day's progress. Delilah found herself missing their quiet evenings together, though they still managed to share the occasional reading session by the fire. On a crisp morning in late October, Delilah woke to an unusual silence. Opening her curtains, she discovered the world transformed. A blanket of white covered the ground, the first substantial snow of the season having fallen during the night. The sun was just rising, casting a golden glow across the pristine landscape. She dressed quickly and descended to the kitchen, stoking the fire to life and beginning preparations for breakfast. The men would need a hearty meal before facing the cold day ahead. Caleb arrived in the kitchen as she was frying bacon, stamping snow from his boots at the door. "Morning," he greeted, his breath visible in the still cold room. "Quite a snow we got, nearly 8 inches by my reckoning." "It's beautiful," Delilah replied, setting a cup of coffee before him, "though I imagine it complicates the work." "That it does. We'll need to break ice on the water troughs. Make sure the cattle have access to feed." He took a grateful sip of coffee. "Miller and Brown are already checking the south pasture. Good men, both of them." "They seem to be," she agreed, turning the bacon in the pan. "Will you be gone all day again?" Something in her tone must have betrayed her feelings, for Caleb gave her a searching look. "Not all day. Thought I might be back by mid-afternoon. There's something I'd like to show you, if you're willing. Curiosity piqued. Delilah nodded. I'll be here. After breakfast, Caleb set out to join his hands, leaving Delilah to her usual tasks. She spent the morning baking bread and preparing a stew for dinner, then turned her attention to mending a tear in one of Caleb's shirts. As promised, he returned in the early afternoon, his cheeks ruddy from the cold but his eyes bright with anticipation. Still interested in that surprise? He asked, standing in the doorway of the sitting room where she was working. Of course, Delilah replied, setting aside her sewing. You'll need your warmest coat and boots, he advised. And a scarf wouldn't go amiss. Intrigued, she gathered the suggested items, wrapping a thick woolen scarf around her neck and pulling on the sturdy boots Caleb had purchased for her last month. Outside, the world glittered in the afternoon sun, the snow crisp underfoot. To Delilah's surprise, a sleigh waited before the house, a simple affair with runners attached to what was normally their wagon, but a sleigh nonetheless. Where did this come from? She asked, delighted. Had it stored in the back of the barn, Caleb explained, helping her onto the seat. Sarah always loved sleigh rides, so I made this years ago. Haven't used it since. Well, in a long time. The mention of his late wife might once have created a barrier between them, but now it felt like a gift, a sharing of his past that honored both Sarah's memory and Delilah's place in his present. Caleb tucked a thick blanket around Delilah's legs, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins. With a gentle command, the horses moved forward, the sleigh gliding smoothly over the snow. They followed a path that led away from the ranch, toward a stand of pines that Delilah had often admired from a distance but never visited. The air was crisp and clean, the only sounds the jingle of the harness bells and the soft shush of the runners on snow. It's like another world, Delilah said, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. That's what I love about the first snow, Caleb replied. Everything familiar becomes new again. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the ranch disappearing behind them as they entered the shelter of the pines. Here, the snow lay in patches where it had filtered through the branches, creating a dappled pattern of white and brown. Eventually, the trees opened onto a small, frozen pond, its surface a perfect mirror of ice. Here we are, Caleb announced, bringing the sleigh to a halt at the pond's edge. What do you think? It's lovely, Delilah said honestly, taking in the peaceful scene. Caleb jumped down and came around to help her descend. Once she was standing beside him, he reached into the back of the sleigh and produced a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. I have something for you, he said, suddenly seeming almost shy. A gift. Delilah accepted the bundle, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a pair of ice skates, delicate compared to the workmanlike pair he pulled out next. Ice skates? She asked, surprised and touched. I noticed you watching the children skating at the festival, he explained. Thought you might like to try it yourself, somewhere more private. The thoughtfulness of the gesture nearly brought tears to her eyes. He had noticed her wistful expression as she watched the town children sliding across a frozen puddle, something she had barely registered herself. I don't know how, she admitted. I can teach you if you'd like, or we can just enjoy the view and head back. No, I want to learn, Delilah said quickly. The idea of gliding across ice, of learning something new and joyful, appealed to her deeply. They sat on a fallen log to change into the skates, Caleb helping Delilah with the unfamiliar laces. When they were both ready, he stood first, then offered his hands to help her up. Standing on the thin blades was immediately more difficult than Delilah had anticipated. She clutched Caleb's hands, wobbling precariously. I've got you, he assured her, his grip firm and steady. Just find your balance first. That's it. Slowly, she steadied herself, Gaining confidence in the strange footwear, Caleb led her carefully onto the ice, still holding both her hands, now facing her as he skated backward with an ease that spoke of long practice. "You've done this before," she observed, concentrating on keeping her balance. "Many times. My father taught me on this very pond when I was a boy." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "You're doing well. Want to try moving on your own?" "Not yet," she said quickly, tightening her grip on his hands. "This is challenging enough." They made slow circuits of the pond, Caleb's patient guidance giving Delilah the confidence to gradually attempt small movements on her own. The first time she glided forward without support, a laugh of pure delight escaped her. "I'm doing it!" she exclaimed, immediately losing her balance and pitching forward. Caleb caught her against his chest, his arms encircling her to prevent a fall. For a moment, they stood perfectly still on the ice, their faces inches apart, breath mingling in the cold air. "I've got you," he said again, his voice deeper than before. "Yes," Delilah replied softly. "You do." Neither moved to break the embrace. Delilah could feel the steady beat of Caleb's heart against her own, the warmth of his body even through layers of winter clothing. His eyes, that startling blue that had first struck her at the auction, searched her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Caleb lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper. When she didn't resist, he kissed her again, more firmly this time, one hand rising to cradle her cheek. Delilah had never been kissed before. She had assumed after the fire that no man would ever want to. Yet here was Caleb, holding her as if she were precious, kissing her as if her scars didn't exist. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Wasn't sure you'd welcome it. Wasn't sure I had the right." He pulled back slightly to look at her. "I still don't know if I do." "You do," Delilah assured him, surprising herself with her boldness. "I've wanted it too." A smile transformed his face, not the reserved half-smile she was accustomed to, but something radiant and unguarded. He kissed her again, and this time Delilah responded more confidently, her arms sliding around his neck. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when they finally returned to the sleigh, their skating lesson abandoned in favor of kisses and quiet conversation on the bank of the pond. As they drove back toward the ranch, Delilah nestled against Caleb's side beneath the blanket, a contentment she had thought forever lost warming her from within. "What happens now?" she asked as the ranch came into view, reality intruding on their idyll. Caleb considered the question seriously. "That depends on what you want, Delilah. I won't pretend my feelings for you are casual, but I understand if yours are less certain." "They're not," she assured him quickly. "Less certain, it's just your scars," he finished when she hesitated. "You think they should matter to me. They matter to everyone else." Caleb brought the sleigh to a halt at the edge of the ranch yard, turning to face her fully. "I see them," he said, his hand rising to trace the line that cut across her cheek. "I see them, and I see the courage it took to survive what caused them. I see the woman who has brought light back into my home and my life." His voice deepened. "And I find her beautiful. All of her." Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes, not of sorrow but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "I've been alone so long," she whispered, "afraid to hope for anything more than basic kindness." "As have I," Caleb admitted. "Perhaps that's why we recognize something in each other. Two survivors, finding a way forward together." The words hung between them, full of promise. Before Delilah could respond, A shout from the direction of the barn broke the moment. "Mr. Shepherd, got a problem with one of the heifers," Miller called, waving from the barn door. Caleb sighed, squeezing Delilah's hand. "Duty calls. But this conversation isn't over." "No," she agreed, a smile playing at her lips. "It's just beginning." As she watched him stride toward the barn, purpose in every step, Delilah touched her fingers to her lips, still warm from his kisses. For the first time in years, the future seemed not just bearable, but bright with possibility. November descended upon the Colorado Territory with a vengeance, bringing with it a series of storms that left the ranch blanketed in snow and ice. The work became harder, the days shorter, but for Delilah, the world had never seemed brighter. In the weeks following their afternoon at the pond, her relationship with Caleb had deepened in ways both subtle and profound. There were stolen kisses in the kitchen when the hands were out with the cattle, lingering touches as they passed each other in the hallway, and quiet conversations by the fire long after the household should have been asleep. Yet they were discreet, mindful of propriety and the presence of Miller and Brown. To the hands, Miss Summers was still the housekeeper, Mr. Shepherd still the boss. If the men suspected anything more between them, they had the good sense not to mention it. One evening, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled around the ranch house, Delilah sat at the kitchen table sorting through the supplies that had arrived that morning from town, the last delivery before the mountain passes potentially closed for winter. Caleb entered from the sitting room, a ledger in hand. "Just checked our accounts. We should be well stocked for the winter, even if we're snowed in for weeks." "That's a relief," Delilah replied, organizing packets of coffee and sugar. "Though I admit, the thought of being trapped here doesn't worry me as it once might have." Caleb set the ledger aside and came to stand behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "No? And why is that?" She tilted her head back to look up at him, a smile playing at her lips. "I think you know why, Mr. Shepherd." He leaned down to kiss her, a gentle touch that held the promise of more. "I believe I do, Miss Summers." The sound of the back door opening sent them stepping apart with practiced ease. Miller stomped in, bringing a gust of cold air and a dusting of snow with him. "Lord Almighty, it's fierce out there," he announced, removing his hat and coat. "Brown's settling the horses for the night. Don't envy the poor beasts in this weather." "Everything secure?" Caleb asked, his tone shifting seamlessly from intimate to businesslike. "Aye, as secure as can be. Cattle are huddled in the south pasture, using the ridge for shelter." Miller nodded to Delilah. "Evening, Miss Summers. Something smells mighty fine." "Beef stew," she replied, rising to check the pot simmering on the stove. "It'll be ready soon. Would you like coffee to warm up?" "Wouldn't say no to that," Miller said gratefully, taking a seat at the table. As Delilah poured coffee for the weathered cowhand, she caught Caleb watching her, his expression soft in a way that made her heart flutter. These moments of domesticity, serving meals, managing the household, caring for the men who worked the ranch, had become precious to her, not because of the tasks themselves, but because of the sense of belonging they represented. After supper, with Miller and Brown retreated to the bunkhouse and the storm still raging outside, Caleb and Delilah found themselves alone in the sitting room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room and keeping the winter chill at bay. "Come here," Caleb said, patting the space beside him on the small sofa. Delilah hesitated only briefly before joining him, still somewhat unused to this new intimacy between them. Caleb draped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "Better," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Been wanting to hold you all day. It's difficult, isn't it?" she said, relaxing into his embrace. "Pretending there's nothing between us when the men are around. Necessary, though, for your reputation if nothing else." Delilah smiled at that. I'm not sure I have much of a reputation left to protect after everything. Caleb's arm tightened around her. You do with me, and I won't have anyone thinking poorly of you, especially not under my own roof. The protectiveness in his voice warmed her as much as the fire. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the wind howl around the eaves and the occasional pop from the burning logs. What are you thinking? Caleb asked eventually, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her arm. Delilah considered the question. I'm thinking how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was standing on an auction block, believing my future held nothing but continued servitude at best, abandonment at worst. And now, she turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. Now I'm happier than I ever thought possible again. Because of you. Caleb caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. It works both ways, you know? This house was just a place to exist before you came. Now it's a home again. The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. Delilah leaned forward, initiating a kiss that Caleb deepened, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. What began as tender quickly became more urgent. Years of loneliness seeking solace in each other's touch. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if gathering himself. We should stop, he said, though his arms remained around her. Should we? Delilah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Caleb pulled back slightly to look at her, his expression serious. Delilah, I don't want you to think. That is, I respect you too much to. I know, she interrupted gently. I know you do. That's why I trust you. He searched her face, his eyes dark in the firelight. There's something I need to say. Something I've been wanting to tell you for weeks now. Delilah's heart quickened. What is it? Caleb took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. I love you, Delilah Summers. I think I started falling for you that first day, when you held your head high despite everything. I know it might seem fast or foolish, but she silenced him with a finger to his lips. It's neither fast nor foolish. And I love you too, Caleb Shepherd. With all my heart. The declaration hung in the air between them, momentous yet somehow inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Marry me? Caleb said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't contain them any longer. Be my wife, my partner. Share this life with me, not as my housekeeper, but as the woman I love. Though she had begun to hope for such a proposal, the reality of it still took her breath away. Are you certain? The town, what they'll say. I don't give a damn what anyone in town says, Caleb interrupted, taking her hands in his. I only care what you say. Delilah's vision blurred with tears of joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb's face transformed with a smile so radiant it seemed to illuminate the room. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. I don't have a ring yet, he said against her hair, but I promise you'll have one, and a proper wedding, as soon as the pass is clear in spring. I don't need a ring, Delilah assured him. I just need you. You have me, he promised. For as long as I live, you have me. Later that night, as Delilah lay in her bed listening to the storm gradually subside, she marveled at the turn her life had taken. From the depths of despair to the heights of joy, from being valued only for her labor to being loved for her self-scars and all. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to look forward not just to tomorrow, but to all the tomorrows that might follow a lifetime of them, with Caleb by her side. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small world of the ranch. Miller took it with a philosophical shrug and a muttered, "About time," suggesting their attempts at discretion hadn't been entirely successful. Brown seemed genuinely pleased, offering awkward but sincere congratulations. December arrived with clear, cold days and nights filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Despite the bitter cold, a sense of warmth and anticipation permeated the ranch house as Christmas approached, the first that any of them had truly looked forward to in years. Delilah threw herself into preparations, determined to make the holiday special. She baked cookies and pies, using precious supplies of sugar and spices with Caleb's enthusiastic blessing. She fashioned decorations from pine boughs and ribbons, hung stockings by the fireplace, and even managed to create small gifts for each of the hands. For Caleb, she worked on a special gift in secret, a quilt made from scraps of fabric she had saved, including a piece of the green dress he had first given her. Each evening after he had gone to his room, she would take out her work, stitching by lamplight until her eyes grew heavy. One afternoon, a week before Christmas, Caleb announced that he needed to ride into town. "The pass is still clear, according to Brown," he explained as Delilah helped him into his heavy coat. "There are a few things we need, and some business I should attend to before the next storm hits." "Be careful," she urged, straightening his collar. "The weather can change quickly this time of year." "I will," he promised, kissing her soundly. "Expect me back by nightfall." As soon as he was gone, Delilah returned to her quilt, determined to finish it before his return. The day passed quietly, the rhythm of her needle punctuated only by the occasional need to tend the fire or check on dinner. By late afternoon, the quilt was complete, a mosaic of colors and patterns that somehow worked together in harmonious whole. Delilah held it up, admiring the result of weeks of work, then carefully folded it and wrapped it in plain brown paper tied with a red ribbon. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, and Delilah found herself glancing frequently at the window, watching for signs of Caleb's return. When the first snowflakes began to fall, her concern deepened. Miller noticed her anxiety when he came in for coffee. "Don't you worry about the boss, Miss Summers. Mr. Shepherd knows these parts better than most. He'll be home before that snow amounts to anything." "I hope you're right," Delilah replied, trying to keep her voice light. "Dinner will be ready in an hour, whether he's back or not." But an hour passed, then two, and the snow continued to fall, no longer in delicate flakes but in thick, swirling curtains that obscured the view beyond the porch. Dinner was kept warm on the stove as Delilah, Miller, and Brown ate in uneasy silence, all of them aware of the empty chair at the head of the table. "I'll take a lantern and ride out a ways," Brown offered when the meal was finished. "Might be he got turned around in the snow." "No," Miller countered firmly. "Last thing we need is two men lost instead of one. Boss wouldn't thank us for that." "But we can't just sit here and do nothing," Delilah protested, her hands twisting in her apron. "We can and we will," Miller replied, his voice gentler than his words. "Mr. Shepherd is smart and experienced. If he couldn't make it back, he'll have found shelter somewhere to wait out the storm. Come morning, if he's not back, we'll go looking." Logically, Delilah knew he was right, but logic did little to calm the fear that had settled in her chest. After the hands returned to the bunkhouse, she remained in the sitting room, a lamp burning in the window as a beacon should Caleb somehow find his way home in the darkness. The house creaked and settled around her, the familiar sounds now seeming ominous in Caleb's absence. Outside, the storm intensified, wind driving snow against the windows with a sound like sand on glass. Midnight came and went. Delilah stoked the fire and continued her vigil, unwilling to retreat to her bed while Caleb might be out in the storm. She tried to pray, but the words stuck in her throat. She had prayed during the fire too, begging God to save her parents, and those prayers had gone unanswered. "Please," she whispered finally, the single word encompassing all her fear and hope. "Please bring him home." Dawn brought no relief. The storm had passed, but in its wake lay nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, pristine and unbroken, no tracks, no sign of Caleb's return. True to his word, Miller organized a search party as soon as there was enough light to see. He and Brown set out on the 2 strongest horses, following the road toward town as best they could discern it beneath the snow. Delilah spent the day in a state of contained panic, keeping busy with household tasks that required little thought, her mind constantly returning to worst-case scenarios. By mid-afternoon, with no sign of either Caleb or the search party, she had begun to fear that something had happened to all of them. She was at the kitchen window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, when she saw them 3 riders approaching slowly from the direction of town. Even at a distance, she recognized Caleb's broad-shouldered silhouette. Relief made her knees weak. She grabbed her coat and rushed outside, heedless of the cold, wading through snow that reached past her ankles. As the riders drew closer, she could see that Caleb was slumped forward in his saddle, with Miller riding close beside him as if ready to catch him should he fall. Brown led a pack horse laden with supplies. "Caleb!" she called, her voice carrying across the silent landscape. He looked up at the sound, straightening slightly in the saddle. Even from a distance, she could see he was pale, with a dark bruise marking one side of his face. Miller reached her first. "He's all right, Miss Summers. Took a fall when his horse slipped on some ice. Spent the night at the Wallace farm about 5 miles from here." Caleb dismounted stiffly, grimacing as his feet touched the ground. Delilah was at his side instantly, supporting him with an arm around his waist. "I'm fine," he insisted, though he leaned heavily against her. "Just sore and tired. And lucky," Miller added grimly. "Could have frozen to death out there if the Wallaces hadn't hurt his horse." Inside, Delilah helped Caleb remove his snow-covered coat and boots, then insisted he sit by the fire while she prepared hot coffee and soup. His left wrist was swollen and discolored, and he admitted, under her persistent questioning, that he thought it might be sprained. "What happened?" she asked as she carefully wrapped the injured wrist in clean bandages. "Was it just the ice? Or did something spook your horse?" "Just the ice," Caleb confirmed. "I was hurrying to get back before the storm hit. Wasn't paying enough attention to the road." He reached into his pocket with his good hand, producing a small velvet box. "Was too focused on getting this home to you." Delilah stared at the box, momentarily forgetting his injury. "What is it? Open it and see," he encouraged, a smile warming his tired face. With trembling fingers, she took the box and lifted the lid. Inside lay a ring, a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the firelight and reflected it in tiny rainbows. "It was my mother's," Caleb explained. "I've had it in the bank in town all these years. Wanted you to have a proper ring, like I promised." Tears blurred Delilah's vision. "It's beautiful, but you shouldn't have risked yourself for it." "Worth every risk," he said simply, taking the ring from the box and sliding it onto her finger. Perfect fit, and it was as if it had been made for her hand, the gold warm against her skin. Delilah looked from the ring to Caleb's face, seeing in his eyes all the love and promise she had ever longed for. "Don't ever scare me like that again," she said, her voice catching. "I thought I'd lost you." "Never," Caleb promised, drawing her close with his good arm. "Takes more than a fall and a snowstorm to keep me from coming home to you." That night, with Caleb safely ensconced in his room to rest, Delilah sat on the edge of her bed, twisting the ring on her finger and marveling at how completely her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a scarred, unwanted servant with no future. Now she wore an engagement ring and was planning a wedding to a man who loved her not despite her scars, but with full acknowledgement of all she had survived. The fear she had felt during Caleb's absence had clarified something for her: just how deeply she loved him, and how empty her life would be without him. It was a frightening realization in its intensity, but also profoundly reassuring. After years of feeling that she had nothing left to lose, she now had everything to live for. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold. The ranch transformed into a winter wonderland that glittered under the bright December sun. Despite his injured wrist, Caleb insisted on joining Miller and Brown to check on the cattle, leaving Delilah to complete her holiday preparations. By the time the men returned in the late afternoon, the house was filled with the scents of pine boughs, cinnamon, and roasting meat. Delilah had outdone herself, preparing a feast that would have been impressive in a town restaurant, let alone a remote ranch house. "Lord have mercy!" Miller exclaimed as he entered the kitchen and saw the spread. "Miss Summers, you've worked miracles here." Delilah smiled, pleased with the effect of her efforts. "It's Christmas Eve. Seems only right to celebrate properly." Caleb came in behind Miller, his face lighting up as he took in the transformed kitchen. "It looks like Christmas used to look when I was a boy," he said, crossing to Delilah and kissing her cheek. "Thank you for this." "Wait until you see the sitting room," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Go on, all of you. I'll bring in the food when it's ready." The sitting room had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. Pine boughs decorated the mantel, tied with red ribbons. Candles in glass holders cast a warm glow over the room. In one corner stood a small evergreen tree, decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries. "A Christmas tree," Caleb said, his voice soft with surprise. "We haven't had one since." "I hope you don't mind," Delilah said quickly. "Brown helped me cut it this morning while you were checking the north pasture." "Mind? It's perfect." Caleb drew her into his arms, heedless of Miller and Brown's presence. "You're perfect." The Christmas Eve supper was a merry affair, with even the usually taciturn Miller contributing stories of holidays past. Brown, the youngest of them at barely 20, spoke wistfully of his family celebrations back in Missouri, though he quickly assured everyone that he was happy to be at the Shepherd Ranch for the holiday. After the meal, they gathered in the sitting room, where Delilah had arranged small gifts for each of them beneath the tree. For Miller, a new pipe and tobacco pouch. For Brown, a hand-knitted scarf and mittens. Both men seemed touched by the thoughtfulness of the gifts, especially when Caleb added that they would each receive a Christmas bonus in their next pay. When it was just the two of them left by the fire, Delilah retrieved her carefully wrapped package from its hiding place. "Merry Christmas, Caleb," she said, placing it in his lap. He unwrapped it carefully, his expression softening as he unfolded the quilt and recognized the scraps of fabric that made up its pattern. "You made this?" he asked, running his hand over the colorful squares. "Over the past few weeks, yes. I wanted you to have something special." Caleb looked up at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "It's beautiful, and so are you." He reached into his pocket and produced a small package. "I have something for you too. Not as impressive as this quilt, I'm afraid." Delilah unwrapped the gift to find a small leather-bound book, a collection of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. "I remembered you saying you loved poetry," Caleb explained. "The bookseller in town recommended this. Said women find her work particularly moving." Delilah opened the book, touched by his thoughtfulness. Inside the cover, Caleb had written a simple inscription. "To Delilah, who brought light back into my life. With all my love, Caleb." "It's perfect," she said, clutching the book to her chest. "Thank you." Caleb pulled her close. The quilt spread across both their laps, and they sat in contented silence, watching the fire slowly die down to embers. It was, Delilah thought, the perfect Christmas, simple but meaningful, filled with warmth and promise. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, his fingers idly stroking her hair. I'm thinking that I never expected to be this happy again, Delilah admitted. After the fire, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I felt the same after losing Sarah and Henry, Caleb said. Like happiness was something that happened to other people, not to me. And now, he smiled, lifting her hand to kiss the ring on her finger. Now I'm looking forward to a lifetime of Christmases with you, starting with our wedding in the spring. Delilah rested her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never thought possible again. Outside, stars glittered in the clear winter sky, and all was peaceful on the Shepherd Ranch. Christmas Day passed in similar harmony, with a late breakfast followed by a quiet day of rest. Miller and Brown rode into town in the afternoon to join some other hands for drinks at the saloon, leaving Caleb and Delilah alone at the ranch. They spent the afternoon reading together by the fire, Delilah discovering the beauty of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets, while Caleb continued his progress through Moby Dick. As dusk fell, they bundled up and went for a short walk, admiring the pristine beauty of the snow-covered landscape. Hard to believe it's almost a new year, Caleb remarked as they stood looking out over the valley, the setting sun painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. 1874. Has a good sound to it, don't you think? It does, Delilah agreed. A year of new beginnings. Speaking of which, Caleb said, turning to face her, I've been thinking about our wedding. What would you say to Easter Sunday? The weather should be decent by then, and it seems fitting a celebration of renewal. Easter Sunday sounds perfect, Delilah replied, her heart warming at the thought, though it seems a long way off. For months, Caleb acknowledged, but we'll be busy enough with winter work and spring preparations. The time will pass quickly. He was right, of course. Winter on a ranch was never truly a quiet time, merely a different kind of busy. There were still cattle to tend, repairs to make, supplies to manage. And with spring would come calving season, the most critical time of year for their livelihood. As they walked back to the house, arm in arm in the gathering darkness, Delilah felt a deep sense of belonging to this land, to this life, and most of all, to the man beside her. The girl who had stood trembling on the auction block seemed like someone from another lifetime, a shadow dispersed by the light of Caleb's love. Race you to the house, Caleb said suddenly, a boyish grin lighting his face. Before she could respond, he was off, running through the knee-deep snow with surprising agility for a man his size. Delilah laughed and gave chase. Her skirts hiked up to allow movement, snow flying as they raced toward the warm glow of home. Caleb reached the porch first, turning to catch Delilah as she arrived breathless and laughing a moment later. He lifted her off her feet in a jubilant embrace, spinning her around as if she weighed nothing. I love you, Delilah Summers, he declared, setting her down but keeping his arms around her waist. More than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Caleb Shepherd, she replied, reaching up to brush snow from his beard. With all my heart. He kissed her then, beneath the vast Colorado sky, with only the stars as witnesses to their promise. And in that moment, Delilah knew with absolute certainty that all the pain and loss she had endured had led her to exactly where she was meant to be. January brought bitter cold to the Colorado Territory, with temperatures dropping so low that breath froze in the air and the snow creaked underfoot. Life on the ranch settled into a winter rhythm, early mornings tending to livestock, days spent on indoor repairs and maintenance, evenings by the fire with books and conversation. For Delilah, the days passed in a pleasant blur of domestic duties and wedding preparations. She had begun work on her wedding dress, using fabric Caleb had ordered specially from Denver, a creamy white silk that felt like water in her hands, more luxurious than anything she had ever owned. In town, news of their engagement had spread, generating a predictable mix of reactions. Some, like Reverend Thomas and his wife, offered sincere congratulations. Others, including Mrs. Wilkins, made little effort to hide their disapproval. Marrying his housekeeper, Delilah overheard Mrs. Wilkins say to another woman during a rare trip to the general store, and such a disfigured one at that. Poor Caleb Shepherd must be desperate indeed. Though the words stung, Delilah found they no longer had the power to wound her deeply. The ring on her finger and the love in Caleb's eyes when he looked at her were proof against such petty cruelties. February arrived with a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and made the roads nearly impassable with mud. Caleb took advantage of the milder weather to ride into town for supplies and mail, returning with a letter that brought a frown to his face. "What is it?" Delilah asked as he sat at the kitchen table, reading the single sheet of paper for the third time. "It's from Sarah's brother, James," Caleb explained, setting the letter down. "He's coming to visit. Says he'll be here within the week." Something in his tone made Delilah pause in her bread-making. "And that's not good news," Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "James and I have a complicated relationship. He blamed me for not getting Sarah to a doctor sooner when she fell ill. Said if I'd been quicker, she might have lived." "That's unfair," Delilah said, wiping flour from her hands and coming to sit beside him. "From what you've told me, you did everything possible. I know that now. Wasn't so sure then." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her ring. "James hasn't been here since the funeral. Hasn't met you, doesn't know about our engagement. I'm not sure how he'll take the news. Does his opinion matter to you?" she asked gently. Caleb considered the question. "Not as much as your happiness does. But he was family once. Still is, in some ways. I'd prefer peace between us, if possible." Delilah squeezed his hand. "Then we'll do our best to welcome him properly. Perhaps seeing you happy again will help heal whatever rift remains between you." Caleb smiled, lifting her hand to his lips. "You're remarkable, you know that? Most women would be worried about meeting their fiancé's former brother-in-law under such circumstances." "Oh, I'm worried," Delilah admitted with a small laugh. "But I trust you, Caleb. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." James Thornton arrived 3 days later, riding up to the ranch house on a tall black gelding just as Delilah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. She saw him first, a lean man with a sharp-featured face partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard, wearing clothes that spoke of city life rather than the frontier. He dismounted, removing his hat as he approached. "Excuse me, miss. I'm looking for Caleb Shepherd. This is his ranch, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," Delilah replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Mr. Thornton. I'm Delilah Summers." Recognition flickered in his eyes. He had noted her scars, though he made a visible effort not to stare. "Miss Summers, you're the housekeeper, I presume." There was something in the way he said housekeeper that made Delilah straighten her spine. "I am employed here, yes, but I'm also Caleb's fiancée." James's eyebrows rose sharply. "Fiancée? Well, that's unexpected." Before Delilah could respond, Caleb appeared from the barn, alerted by the arrival of a rider. His expression was carefully neutral as he approached. "James," he greeted, extending his hand. "Good to see you." "I see you've met Delilah." James shook Caleb's hand briefly. "Just now, yes. She was sharing some interesting news." "Our engagement," Caleb said, moving to stand beside Delilah, his hand finding the small of her back in a subtle gesture of support. "We're to be married at Easter. So I hear. Congratulations." The words sounded forced. "Perhaps we could talk inside? It's been a long ride." Caleb nodded. "Of course. Delilah, would you mind? I'll prepare some coffee and sandwiches," she said. understanding his unspoken request for a moment alone with his former brother-in-law. Take Mr. Thornton into the sitting room. I'll join you shortly. As she worked in the kitchen, Delilah could hear the low murmur of men's voices from the sitting room, occasionally rising in what sounded like disagreement before falling again. She took her time with the coffee and food, giving them space for whatever needed to be said. When she finally entered the sitting room with a tray, both men fell silent, turning to look at her with expressions that suggested their conversation had indeed been about her. Coffee and sandwiches, she announced, setting the tray on the small table. And there's apple pie if you're interested, Mr. Thornton. Thank you, Miss Summers, James replied, his tone polite but cool. And please call me James. We're to be family, apparently. The slight emphasis on apparently didn't escape her notice. Delilah poured coffee for both men, then took a seat beside Caleb on the small sofa, deliberately taking his hand in hers. How long will you be staying with us, James? She asked, determined to maintain civility despite the tension in the room. Just a few days, he replied, picking up his coffee cup. I have business in Denver next week. Thought I'd stop by on my way, see how Caleb was faring. His gaze moved between them. Finding him engaged is quite a surprise. A pleasant one, I hope, Delilah said, meeting his eyes steadily. James's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. That remains to be seen, Miss Summers. I don't mean to be rude, but I'm naturally concerned about my late sister's husband, particularly given the unusual circumstances. If you're referring to how we met, Caleb has no doubt explained, Delilah said, her voice calm despite the knot forming in her stomach. As for my scars, they're the result of a fire that killed my parents. I survived. Some might consider that fortunate rather than unfortunate. A flicker of respect showed in James's eyes. Caleb mentioned the fire, yes. I'm sorry for your loss. As I am for yours, she replied, softening her tone. Sarah sounds like she was a wonderful woman. I know Caleb treasures her memory, as do you. James studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if coming to some internal decision. She was wonderful. The best of us Thorntons, everyone agreed. He turned to Caleb. I owe you an apology, Caleb. What I said after the funeral. It was grief speaking, not reason. I know you did everything you could for her and Henry. Caleb's hand tightened around Delilah's. Thank you, James. That means a great deal. Still, James continued, his gaze returning to Delilah. This engagement comes as a shock. You'll understand if I have concerns. About what, exactly? Caleb asked, an edge entering his voice. James set down his coffee cup. About whether you're marrying Miss Summers for the right reasons. Whether this is a matter of convenience rather than love. Caleb interrupted. Because I assure you, I love Delilah deeply. More than I thought possible after losing Sarah. And you, Miss Summers? James turned his penetrating gaze on her. What are your feelings for Caleb? Though the question bordered on impertinence, Delilah answered without hesitation. I love him with all my heart. He saw value in me when others saw only scars. He gave me a home when I had none. But more than that, he treats me as an equal and fills my life with joy and hope. I could not ask for a better partner. She held James's gaze, determined to convey her sincerity despite the tension in the air. The moment stretched, silence lingering until James nodded slowly, seemingly weighing her words. Very well, he said finally, a hint of warmth breaking through his stern demeanor. If your engagement is built on love, then I see no reason to oppose it. I merely wanted to ensure Caleb knew what he was choosing. Caleb relaxed slightly, relief washing over his features. Thank you, James. Your support means more than I can say. James offered a half smile, then turned his attention back to Delilah. "If you'll forgive my initial reservations, Miss Summers, I look forward to seeing how you bring your warmth and light into my brother-in-law's life. It's something we all could use." Delilah smiled at the unexpected acceptance, grateful for the chance to prove herself to Caleb's past. For the first time, she felt like she was being seen, not just as Caleb's scarred housekeeper, but as a woman worthy of love and respect. As the conversation continued, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the newly united family. Delilah held Caleb's hand tightly, her heart swelling with optimism for the future, for the shared life they were building together.